Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to the Amberdata Podcast. Today, I'm super excited to have Michael Kong on. Michael Kong is the founder and CEO of Sonic Labs, which is responsible for building Sonic Chain, which is previously Fantom. So, Michael, welcome to the podcast. Super excited to have you on.
Hey Matt, really appreciate it. Thanks so much as well.
Absolutely. So Michael, before we dive into everything that you guys are building and working on, I think it's obviously cryptos in the blockchain space is kind of like a black hole for talent. And I think understanding like what pulled people in and what got them excited about this space is always really interesting. Before we kind of jump into what you're working on right now, would you mind giving us a background on where you were prior to the Web3 space, kind of your transition into the space, and then all the way into, I mean, building your own network, which I can't imagine is a small undertaking.
Yeah, so I originally heard about Bitcoin. I think it was about in 2012, because I was listening to a very famous podcaster who's kind of like a bit notorious in the cryptocurrency of the blockchain space now, called Peter Schiff. And he was talking a lot about how there was this thing called Bitcoin coming out, and that he didn't really believe that it was the store of value. He thought that it was, something that was just going to like come and go, and that it didn't really have like much longevity. But to be fair to him, he also like brought on board or debated with a whole bunch of people that were in the space at the time, such as like Eric Borges, I remember, and a few others. And so, he was a pretty good debater and pretty polite about it. But because I was very much like a Peter Schiff fanboy, and in some respects I still am, but not on this issue, obviously. I kind of like believed him and said, yeah, I don't really see how this is going to work. There was something in the past called DigiCash that had a similar idea that didn't really work. There were a few other similar ideas I was aware of that also didn't really work prior to Bitcoin. And so I kind of thought that, oh, maybe this is not going to like really work in the end as well. But then around 2013, I was talking to a few other people who were saying that, oh, actually, you should take this a lot more seriously. That this is a form of decentralized money. It's a way of getting around central banking. It's a way of staying true to what money should be, which is not something that can be inflated in to infinity by any central authority. And so I had a more serious look at it then, and I got a lot more interested, but not really so much from a technical point of view, because I kind of saw it as just like a form of payments, and I didn't really want to work in the payment space. And around that time, I was studying at university. I was doing what you could do like two degrees simultaneously. So I was doing a degree in finance and computer science or IT, and I wasn't really interested in working kind of in the payment space, which is what I saw it as. But then around 2015 or 2016, there were a number of people that were going around in university, I would say, evangelizing this thing called Ethereum. And one of them, happened to like approach me and others and was like, oh, have you heard of this thing called Ethereum? I mean, you've heard of Bitcoin, right? Yeah. Well, Ethereum, you see, is like Bitcoin, but you have these things called smart contracts, which are these distributed computer programs. And, it's basically going to be the future. And you'll be able to build all sorts of financial applications and trading applications and, proof of assets and all that. A lot of it, I have to say, which has come true. And so that was very compelling to me that, oh, this technology isn't just like about money and payments. It's also about so many other things that, very disruptive. So it was around that time that I started to get a lot more interested, like technically speaking and career wise as well. And fortunately, I was able to participate in a research project around verifying smart contracts at a programmatic level at my university, the University of Sydney, and that was under a professor called Professor Bernard Scholz, who's like an expert in virtual machines and programming languages, who is our chief research officer now and really leading like the Sonic technology. And so, um, and then basically in mid to late 2017, I started up one of the first blockchain funds in Australia with a few people from traditional finance. And then basically we were advising also on a few ICO projects. And one of the ICO projects that we encountered was this project called Fantom. That was originally a project that was started in Korea. And the founder the original guy involved in that project claimed that he had this amazing technology called Lachesis, and it could do all this amazing stuff using what we call asynchronous technology, which is basically a way of confirming transactions, converting multiple transactions simultaneously, more or less. And if that was all true, that would have been fantastic because, this is back in 2018. There were very few that would basically know actually alternative smart contract platforms to Ethereum. So this was a very compelling narrative, and his background appeared to be very solid. So we worked with him, and we did an ICO for Fantom from early to mid 2018, and it was one of the most popular ICOs I think at the time. It raised about $41 million. But then we soon discovered around early July that the technology he talked about was actually not real, and that he had plagiarized other technology. And this has all been established in a lawsuit that we won in the Seoul High Court, where the court ruled that yes, he indeed plagiarized and he almost destroyed the entire project. And that's where like Andre kind of came in, because Andre was back then a technical reviewer for a project called the media company Crypto Briefing, and he did like a number of different ICO reviews, including on Fantom. And so I think he reached out to Fantom maybe in about like May 2018, trying to understand the technology because he thought that it sounded very interesting. And then around June is when he reviewed like a technical paper on the technology, and he and a few others discovered that it was not as it was advertised to be. And so now we're in the situation where okay, the technology is not real. It's we're in a lot of trouble. We raised a whole bunch of money. Do we just close down the project, or we try and do something? And Andre said, "Well, I've have a background in distributed computing, in blockchain technologies or related technologies. Let's try and build a whole bunch of different ideas and try it out." And so we went to the drawing board, and he put together a whole bunch of different ideas, and then we built a new technical team around it. And then we were eventually able to launch the first version of the network in the end of December 2019. And a lot of people were surprised about it because they thought that the project had died and that it was just one of these, ICO projects that just came and went. So I've been speaking for a while, so I just stopped there. Yeah.
No, I think it's super interesting because I think kind of learning through the history of kind of back in the 2018, 2019 ICO era to things that I mean they do take time to implement, but kind of the journey to get to putting pen to paper and building those networks is generally not a linear path. And so I think one of the things that's interesting is in that time period, you had a lot of foundational tech and protocols being built by some of the leaders in the space that are now kind of some of the most prolific protocols and chains in kind of the industry. And so I know you mentioned Andre. I think for those who aren't familiar, maybe there's only pretty much one Andre in crypto, but can you kind of give Andre's background and like who he is and why that matters? Because I think he's gone on to do a lot of net positive for the space in general. So I think interesting to hear him kind of leading that charge and saying like let's commit to what we're gonna do.
Yeah. So Andre, for people who don't know, his name is Andre Fournier. He's very well known in the blockchain space as sort of quote unquote the DeFi god, right? So if you Google like Andre Fournier, it comes up with references to him as like the DeFi god, because he's very well known to have been like one of the early pioneers in decentralized finance. I think beginning in early 2020 with Iron, and then that became Yearn, and he worked on a few other protocols as well that have become what we call like primitives in the space, i.e., like the building block technologies that many other DeFi projects nowadays still use to varying degrees. And so, but he also was involved in the Fantom project um, years beforehand, as I mentioned, like around May or June 2018. And he's a very intelligent guy. He's probably like the smartest engineer that I've ever met. He's super productive. He's a super funny guy. And he I'm not going to like say otherwise because this is absolutely true. He is largely responsible why the project still exists to this day. Because if he was not around in that crucial period that I just mentioned in around early July 2018, I would have, and I think others would have said, okay, let's not do this project. Let's hand the money back. Let's just work on something else. But he gave us hope. And, you could say there was a bit of a gamble at the time and stuff, without the benefit of hindsight. But I looked at his work and, I'm not as technical as him, but I looked at his work and I spoke with others. I just had a feeling that it's worth a shot seeing what he could do with the ideas that he had. And it turned out to be very, very good. So, Andre is, of course, very well known for his DeFi work, but he also contributed very, very significantly to the success that we've had at Fantom. And he's doing a lot more as well as we go into the new Sonic network.
That's amazing. It's super interesting because that was such like a formative time in the early stages of crypto, especially from Phantom and now Sonic being an alternative smart contract platform that didn't exist. So to really kind of like jump in both feet and say, okay, we're going to commit to doing this. So, okay, so you guys were able to kind of navigate that whole landscape. You had the right, uh, like the right technical pieces in place to actually deliver. When you guys started, can you kind of talk about like what was the design between like why did we want to build a competitive smart contract platform? What were some of the trade-offs that you considered, like the shortcomings of ETH versus what you decided to build? Can you kind of talk about like those
Yeah.
pieces?
Yeah, so the original guy at Fantom, his name is Arn, the one who plagiarized.
Mhm.
He said that his motivation for building a new network was that Ethereum was too slow and too costly, even back in 2018, to really run like a large scale application. And so he was saying that, we need to use newer technology like this asynchronous computing that I talked about before and other things to basically be able to build a network that can handle applications with large volumes of transactions, right, at low fees. And that still is, to a large extent, like more or less the technical vision at Fantom, now Sonic. And it is like a similar technical vision that other projects have as well. And so, like what Andre proposed were different like ideas around this concept of asynchronous processing of transactions, which, as I mentioned before, is essentially being able to process multiple transactions simultaneously rather than one at a time or one block at a time, which is like how Ethereum traditionally operates. And so Andre had studied a lot of papers from different people in the distributing and convening space going back, several decades and taking several ideas and putting them together. For example, and I won't get too technical here, to help order the transactions. For example, he read a paper about what's called Lamport timestamps, and it was created by this guy who I believe was, maybe still is, like a researcher at Microsoft, I think back in the 1980s. And so, for example, he took like that concept that was kind of like done in isolation and combined it with many other concepts from other papers, from open source papers, to basically put it like a whole system together and go like, okay, here's kind of the design through and through that will allow us to build this kind of like distributed network. So that's essentially what happened. Like Andre just had a lot of ideas. He just experimented with them, played around with them. Same with a couple of other people that we hired. And then we basically built a team to kind of like realize those ideas and kind of build upon them afterwards.
Interesting. So from the standpoint of like the tech didn't actually exist at the time of the ICO to the
No.
ideation that Andre was able to kind of say, here's different pieces that kind of can get us to a point where that vision is more or less feasible. Like you were able to close that gap and say, okay, even at the time, I mean, that's pretty insightful to think like, while in 2018 gas fees were relatively cheap, I mean, Ethereum itself was, an affordable asset at the time to kind of use as a gas asset. But you have like the foresight to see as these networks grow, as the number of assets and transactions and throughput requirements change, like the ability to asynchronously manage transactions and throughput does become more and more important instead of rather than following kind of a linear path across the entire transaction sequence.
Well, even like back then, we had instances where the Ethereum network was getting significantly clogged and the fees were going up significantly. For example, I think it was in like in 2016 or 2017, there was a whole crypto kitties phenomenon, right? Which was kind of like the first big, I would say like the first big like NFT like project that launched. It got a lot of hype, a lot of speculation, and people were just like constantly meeting breeding and minting these crypto kitties, which were just like, pictures of, cats in cartoon form, and that clogged the network significantly. And it did it for quite a long time, if I remember correctly. So like these sort of bottleneck problems were kind of already known back then in 2018. It was just that a lot of technology hadn't evolved since then. You didn't have all these alternative layer ones that we do now have. You didn't have zero knowledge technology. You didn't have any. I don't think people were even talking about like the concepts of layer twos back then. You had some alternative technologies that I don't think people remember these nowadays, called like Plasma and Radian and a few others that don't really exist anymore as far as I'm aware. So a lot of things have changed then, but the fundamental problem was still I think well known back then.
Yeah, and even at like a more basic level, I remember there's like times of market volatility where just like moving assets to an exchange were kind of bottlenecked because everybody's trying to rush to exit, on your off ramps on, your exchanges, and throughput just couldn't handle it from time to time. And so I think, there was just like more general issues around scaling. Now, I think obviously, as to your point, like L2s, there was no L2 narrative. There's no L2s that existed at the time. So really the only option is a faster layer one with more throughput. And so as Sonic's beginning to kind of like move into its next wave, what are you guys like focused on? Like, what's the core of the mission like right now? What are you guys focused on building day to day?
Yeah, so like the overall mission um at Sonic is really um creating a network that is sustainable. And what I mean by that is we're in the business essentially of selling computing power, right? That's what a transaction is. It's fundamentally a form of computing power. It's a form of, executing a series of instructions and storing the result on chain, right? And people pay transaction fees, which are supposed to cover the cost of that and be given to validators to make a profit, right? And so that's like the foundational core business that we are running at Sonic, right? And then from that foundation, you kind of build upon that and you figure out, okay, so how do we achieve that? How do we maximize that, right? Well, it comes down to thinking about, okay, who are our customers? The customers are kind of two categories of people. They're the developers or the people who build the applications on the distributed network, and they're the users, right? And in terms of developers, who are developers? Developers are basically business people. They are building applications in order to make money, and that requires people to be able to use the applications, and that requires that there's solid technology to be able to handle those amount of users and to have what we call low time to finality. In other words, to have very fast confirmation times, because that obviously increases or improves significantly the user experience, which encourages more people to want to interact with that application. And then on the other side, you've got users, and what do users want to do, right? Users want to have fun on chain and they want to make money, right? And what does that come down to? Well, it also comes down to, having solid technology, as I mentioned before. People want to have low transaction fees. People don't want to have bottlenecks on the network where transaction fees spike and you can't submit transactions on the network and they take a very long time. And people want to be able to submit those transactions fast so they can get on with their lives and do stuff, which is why there's always such a focus on, website speed and optimization and being able to load stuff as quickly as possible. So those are like the kind of the two types of users. And in terms of like going into more detail about the technology and what we're working on, a lot of it is about achieving scalability, right? And that means, high network, the ability to have high network throughput and
Mhm.
also maintain low confirmation times. And that's a lot of the work that we've been doing, from the beginning, but especially in the past 2 months, which with the new Sonic technology that we've got, that's already partially come out on the existing Fantom chain, but will be fully coming out on the new Opera network, sorry, on the new Sonic network. And that entails things like a new way to store data, what we call Sonic DB or Sonic database, a new way to execute smart contracts, what we call Sonic VM or Sonic virtual machine, and many different improvements to consensus and the way that what we call the client technology works. And essentially, all of these features combine together to allow you to process transactions at large scale in a very fast manner using a lot of like very like deep technology. And that's led by, as I mentioned before, Professor Bernard Schultz, who has spent like, I don't know, 20 or 30 years just working on virtual machines, working on program security, working on optimizing how fast programs can be executed on computers. And he's applying all of that knowledge to basically blockchain technology that he's been involved in since 2016. So I think we have the right team with a lot of very deep technical experience to build out what we need from a technical point of view.
Interesting. So, in terms of like the Sonic network and some of the things that you guys are upgrading, you mentioned Sonic VM and Sonic DB. Can you kind of discuss high level what are like the optimizations that you've been able to make, and like why does it allow for a better experience, higher, quicker finality, more throughput? Can you not, maybe not like super in the weeds, but like kind of like what's the high level trade-offs even that you've taken into consideration while making those optimizations?
Yeah, sure. So, with regards to the Sonic virtual machine, so just taking a step back, like what is a virtual machine? A virtual machine is essentially a computer program that helps you execute other computer programs. Now, that might sound like a little bit tautological or a little bit like circular, right? But the computer that we're speaking on right now, your mobile phone, any sort of computer system, or the vast majority of them, will have what's known as a virtual machine, right? And that means that if I write a computer program, it has to be able to run on the computer, right? And so the way that it runs on the computer is that you code it up and then you deploy it on the computer. And then when you press run, it basically sends a whole bunch of instructions to the virtual machine, and this virtual machine translates it into what's known as machine code. Because essentially, a computer program or the way that computers work is that in the end, it's all about switches, right? Transistors, right? It's all about zeros and ones. And so when you're writing a computer program, you're not writing it in zeros and ones, right? You're writing it in, like English-based text, essentially these instructions. And so these instructions need to be translated into these zeros and ones. And the intermediary step to do that is what's known as a virtual machine. So why is a virtual machine important? Because it allows us in this context, is because it allows us to execute smart contracts on the blockchain network. So what are we doing on the virtual machine? Well, essentially what we have is I would describe it as a very optimized version of what's known as the Ethereum virtual machine. So the Ethereum virtual machine is a virtual machine technology that exists on Ethereum and many other chains, including the current Fantom network, that allows you to execute smart contracts on Ethereum and other networks. What we've done is that we identified that there's a lot of ways that you can optimize the virtual machine such that when you're doing the translation from the English-based code or Solidity code into that lower level language that actually runs the computer, that it does it in a very like optimal manner. And so the way that we do that, for example, is ideas around like super instruction sets where essentially you can combine multiple instructions into a single instruction. So you only have to execute like one instruction instead of like three at the same time. There's like different methods as to like how you um, how you execute the sequence of instructions on top of that, and just like a lot of like other like very technical optimizations that we've done to improve performance. So that's what I mean by the virtual machine. In terms of the Sonic DB, what a database is a method of storing data, right? So we all use databases on our laptops and when we interact with all sorts of different websites. And databases are important because they don't just store data, but also like how you retrieve data, how you write data, how you do analysis of data, all needs to be optimized, right? Because if you have a database which is slow to retrieve data from, then it means that every time you need to retrieve data in order to execute a computer program, it's just going to slow things down, right? So what we've done on the database side is that we also have created like very optimized version of how you store data on the blockchain and how you retrieve the data as well. And because of those optimizations, we're able to like significantly reduce how much data you need in order for the network to keep operating. So reduce the amount of storage requirements to represent all the transactions on the network and the computer programs or the smart contracts on the network, and also different data structure techniques in order to speed up the process of sending and receiving data. And why is that, or writing and reading data? And why is that important? Because when the smart contract, ultimately needs to write a transaction to the network, if you optimize the reading and the writing, that means you're going to get a faster transaction in the end, right? That means that you have lower confirmation times. It also means that you can execute more transactions simultaneously, which means that you have the higher network throughput. So I hope that wasn't too technical, but that's
No,
essentially like what the technology is. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's important to understand because if it, even in the L2 space, you're making trade-offs kind of across the board. And I think understanding what those trade-offs are or what those optimizations are or where kind of those efficiency gains come from really add to like why somebody would want to either be, to your point, there's kind of two people that participate in the network. They're the developers and the people who are building protocols, and then they're the users that either want to make money or have fun on chain. And so to do that, you really have to have the best chain or the best experience or the easiest development pipeline. And I think that's one of to kind of move from the more technical side to like the more user centric side. You mentioned that those are kind of the two user segments. Now, in my experience, like developing in a blockchain environment requires a lot of infrastructure, tooling, partners. Like you can just write Solidity, but like if you don't have a block explorer, if you don't have wallet infrastructure, if you don't have node provider, there's a lot of like infrastructure pieces that make your network better too. While the VM and the database side can be as optimized as possible, if you don't have those like other core components, it still makes the user experience difficult. It makes the engineering side a little bit more challenging. So can you kind of talk about like what you guys are doing from kind of I don't want to say onboarding, but like the infrastructure pieces. I know I've used your scanner, like that's obviously like a core component to visibility into the network. I saw you guys did some stuff with from a data perspective. I saw you did some subgraph work, but can you kind of discuss like the infrastructure and the pieces and partnerships that like really make it easy for builders to onboard and kind of how you're
Yeah,
thinking
no,
like a business development standpoint too.
yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, everything that we've just been discussing, like about the VM, the DB, has to do with like the underlying chain performance, right? Or essentially the underlying blockchain performance. But on top of that, you have, you know, a whole bunch of infrastructure tools that developers need, right? Because if we didn't have those tools, a developer would have a lot of great difficulty being able to deploy an application on the network was there was essentially had to build their own like little microservices, right? Which is just it's just not feasible because as a developer, what you're interested in doing is building the application that you want to build, right? The business that you want to build. You don't want to worry about all of the tooling, right? It's like if I want to open up a cafe, I want to be there being able to like make coffee and food, etc. I don't want to worry about, okay, I got to build my own payments network. Oh, I got to build my own furniture and that sort of thing. You just want those tools already available. And so for us, it's been very, very important that we have the right infrastructure partners on board as early as possible for the new Sonic network. And we have a bunch of infrastructure partners that existed on the Opera network that are coming to the Sonic network. But we also have new infrastructure partners or new features that we previously didn't have on the Opera network that, maybe had we should have had earlier on that we now have for the Sonic network. So, for example, in the original current or the current Fantom network, um, we didn't have what's known as CCIP, right, or cross-chain infrastructure protocol, interoperability protocol from Chainlink, right? But now we just recently announced a day or two ago that we're going to have this CCIP technology from Chainlink on the Sonic network. And why is that important? Because a lot of people use this CCIP technology for their applications, right? or things like VRS, variable random functions, also very important. We have more providers there on the new Sonic network, and just different toolings in terms of analytics, in terms of stable coins, in terms of RPC providers, in terms of Oracle providers like Chainlink and others. These are all essential tools that developers need in order to build whatever application they want to build, whether it's in like DeFi or elsewhere. So we're very much going through and getting those partners on board, and we're announcing them in due course, as we've already announced a whole bunch.
That's amazing. And I do think it's such an important piece because as much as the VM and optimizing the network is, without the pieces to kind of, to your point, like I don't want to build the furniture and make a coffee maker to make coffee. I just want to build a business around the tools that exist. And so I think like obviously to bring in kind of the developer standpoint, like having those pieces in place is so fundamentally important. But as I was kind of reading through some of your documentation, there's a lot of other things I found super interesting around like incentive alignment. So like crypto is really interesting because you have so many challenges that you need to tackle in terms of not only building a more performant network, but also getting the right partners in place to incentivizing people to build and bridge liquidity and use your network. One of the things I thought, and I haven't really spent much time or seen this in other networks, but was kind of the gas monetization idea. Can you kind of talk through that? Because I thought that was like I thought that was a really unique position from a developer or somebody building in the network from a value capture perspective.
Yeah, so the gas monetization was really an original idea that Andre came up with, I think, in 2022, and it's based on the the concept of monetization that you have, for example, with video content platforms such as YouTube, right? So the way that the YouTube monetization project program works is that they basically share um, revenue with the content creators, right? And you need content creators. YouTube needs content creators, otherwise people are not going to go on YouTube, right? And so, they share the advertising revenue with the content creators.
Mhm.
And for us, we thought that was a very significant concept because, as I mentioned before, like the purpose of on the underlying business model at its fundamental level for Sonic is we're selling computing power, right? Which
Mhm.
means that we need to have popular applications on it that users are using and submitting large volume of transactions because that's how we generate the most revenue for the network. And so if you incentivize people to generate revenue for the network, if you incentivize builders to build popular applications and you reward them for doing so, then it creates like a mutually beneficial arrangement. And so that's basically like the crux of gas monetization, that um, when you build an application and someone executes a transaction that interacts with your application, you get a percentage of the transaction fees that go directly to you as a developer. And so it's essentially another stream of another revenue stream, right? So you not only got your application that earns its own fees, for example, in DeFi, it could be, like fees from lending and borrowing and liquidations, but now you've got an extra source of revenue, which is the amount of transactions, the user activity on your network.
Mhm.
And one big difference with gas monetization on the Sonic network is that we're going to start ramping it up to 90% of the transaction fee, right? Up from 15%. So a six-fold increase with some select experimental applications. And the reason being is we want to see, okay, if we significantly increase the revenue share to developers, combined with the vastly superior network capacity that we're going to have for Sonic compared to the existing network, would that incentivize builders to want to build on Sonic? Because now they can see that, okay, I'm going to choose Sonic over other chains or building my own chain because not only will I have great technology that I can rely on that isn't going to go down, that isn't going to have gas spikes, that has very fast confirmation times, but I'm also going to have this significant source of revenue where if I'm building a DeFi application, if I'm building a game, if I'm building whatever, if I just make my application popular, the fact that it generates transaction fees is already going to be a significant revenue source for me in addition to already what my business model currently is. Um, so that's the motivation between gas monetization. We already have an existing, we already have the existing technology and infrastructure set up on the Fantom network, and we're going to port over the technology over to the Sonic network and make a whole bunch of new changes to it and improvements that I, for example, just outlined, like beginning by increasing it by sixfold.
That's amazing. That's super interesting. And I think like that's a really to your point, like it doesn't change the underlying business model for the applications being built. It's kind of secondary to building a good application. If you don't build a good application that doesn't capture volume, you don't capture those transaction fees or any of the revenue in the transactions themselves. But it incentivizes like the right flow of builders and building the things that solve the biggest problem as well.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the tech for gas monetization is built and ready to go as you transition from to the Sonic network. Can you kind of talk about the transition? Because I know there's the FMT token, and then that'll be transitioned to the S token. And can you kind of talk about the whole transition pipeline from and to the Sonic network?
Yeah, so the current token that exists on the native token that exists for the Fantom network is called FTM, right? And that's widely traded and that's used for staking, for paying transaction fees, for governance, etc. All those same features are going to be available for the new Sonic network. And so the new Sonic network being a new chain will have a new token called the S token. And so the way that the transition is going to happen is that when we launch the new network towards the end of the year, there will be essentially a gateway or a way of being able to trade in your FTM to S at a one-to-one ratio. And so that means that all the FTM that you have right now, you will be able to, from day one, convert that to the S token, and it will be immediately available in the same wallet on the S network. So that's essentially how the migration is going to work in terms of the token. Obviously, we've been talking to different data providers and exchanges about incorporating the S token, which is very important, and that's been happening. So, for example, I think on CoinMarketCap and CoinGecko, they already have the S token reserved for the Sonic network and a lot of detail there about it. So that will become live. So yeah, that's essentially how it's going to work. I don't think it'll be super complicated. People who have been used to people who are used to using bridges will find the interface to be very familiar. And as soon as you bridge your FTM to S, you'll be able to start using it right away. And for a period of time, I think for at least several months, you'll be able to swap back and forth. So FTM to S and then S to FTM. But then eventually, we will close that two-way bridge and make it a one-way bridge, so you can only move FTM to S because ultimately, obviously, we want to have the adoption be focused on the new Sonic network rather than the old network.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, and I generally think like your on-chain user wouldn't have any issues or bridging from one to a new network. I think just from like an implementation standpoint and kind of like as networks mature and go through upgrades, just kind of understanding what they would need to do to go through that. So as you guys kind of get to the point, is there like I don't know if it's been shared or if you guys have dates set on when that transition is planning to occur, when you plan on going through those upgrades, or is that something we should pay attention to in the near future?
So we'll have a specific date um, in the near future. I'll just say that the new network is going to be launched, planned to be launched before the end of the year.
Okay.
And we're making very good progress in that matter. And by the new network, I don't just mean like the new Sonic Network L1, but also this Sonic Gateway technology, the bridge between Ethereum to the new Sonic network, plus the ability to be able to convert your FTM to S.
Amazing. Well, Michael, I think like I mean it sounds like you guys have a lot of stuff going on and I'm really excited to kind of stay informed on all the upgrades. If there's any where's the best place for anybody to go learn about the Sonic network, building on the Sonic network? Can you kind of point to the best resources for anybody to dive deeper? And then as well as any information that you'd like to to share on yourself or where they can follow and find more information as well?
Yeah, sure. Just before I answer that question, I just want to quickly talk about this new Sonic Gateway that I just mentioned because I don't think we've covered it yet, but I think it's very important for the new technology. So one of the new motivations of building this new Sonic network is being able to have integrated quite deeply what we call a Sonic Gateway or a bridge. And what this is that it's essentially its own network that allows us to bridge, for example, from Ethereum to Sonic and back and forth. And the key reason we are doing this is because we need like a decentralized, safe bridge for the individual user, which we didn't have previously for the Fantom network. And so the way that it works is that you have a validator set that initially will be the same validator set for the Sonic network that will verify the bridge transactions going back and forth. And so when you bridge from Ethereum to or from Ethereum to the Sonic network, for example, you will get a proof of receipt essentially on the Ethereum network that proves that you bridged, this particular asset over. And what that means is that essentially we have a fail safe. So if the bridge were to happen in the unlikely event the bridge were to go down, or the unlikely event that the Sonic network were to go down for a period of 14 days, you would, after that period of time, be able to withdraw 100% of your assets on the originating chain. And that's very important because it means that, even if the bridge goes down, you still have access to your funds. Whereas like with traditional bridges, the bridge goes down, your bridge assets are kind of screwed, right? And what's also important to note is that this feature isn't something that is controlled by like, me as an individual or, a multi-sig or the Sonic Foundation itself. It's inbuilt into the network where it's the individual user that has that proof of receipt and is the only one or the only one who controls the wallet can execute that proof of receipt to get the money back. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that. And yeah,
That, that's such a unique, I mean, that's such a huge value, especially in like the nature of decentralization. I think that there's a lot of misunderstandings when people bridge assets and it could be sitting in a multi-sig wallet and it depends on like the number of signers to have like an actual network of proof to say to have the proof that says on the originating chain this was me and then have the receipt on the other side that says you have a representation of those assets on the other side becomes like increasingly more valuable. And I think that's one of the pieces in the bridge and kind of the shared sequencer, like the centralized sequencer space. I think a lot of people maybe don't, they're just happy that it works from a user perspective. But I think that there's like underlying risks and trade-offs that you need to understand from that. So that's really interesting as part of the upgrades that you guys are making.
yeah, that's a very good point that you raised. That a lot of the L2 technologies out there are really run in this like multi-sig or centralized manner, where an organization, a group of individuals, ultimately control or consensus transactions or control the ordering of the data that's being written back into Ethereum, and that's something that is not going to be the case for the new Sonic Gateway. It's going to be controlled by well, ultimately the code and by the individual users who are bridging their assets or moving their assets.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, it sounds like you guys have a lot of stuff in the works, and I'm really excited to see kind of where it all, how it all plays out in the near future. So, end of year, we'll pay close attention for the Sonic Network launch. In the meantime, any links and resources I'd love to share and add to the description of the episode. But is there anything you wanted to share in terms of best places for research, resources, information on what you guys are building or yourself personally?
Yeah, the best way to keep up to date with the latest stuff is on X, or Twitter. So at 0x Sonic Labs is the name of our account now. My personal account is Michael F. Kong. I do a whole bunch of tweeting there and retweeting and sharing a bunch of like other stuff as well. People can also follow Andre Fournier at Andre Fournier. But all of those links will be in the description, I guess. So, just click there, and that's the best way to keep up to date with what we're doing because whenever we release news, the first venue that we go to is X.
Amazing. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining. Really excited to see what kind of comes in the future for you guys. Thanks again.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks again, Pat. Yeah, really appreciate it.